Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mahrukh Hassan, and I am the Secretary of the LSESU Pakistan Development Society. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the second session of this year's LSE Future of Pakistan conference, titled Pakistan's Economy, Sustainable Growth and Sovereign Debt. The economy remains at the forefront of Pakistan's modern challenges. We have the unfortunate distinction of being the country to have received the greatest number of loans and bailout packages from the International Monetary Fund, the total amounting to 21. Furthermore, Pakistan has roughly doubled its debt every 5 years over the last quarter century. Indeed, economic development and growth cannot be sustainable when debt is growing at an average of 14% each year relative to the 3% per annum growth of the national economy. Successive administrations have attempted to put the nation on the road to recovery, but the stride towards economic prosperity is faced with far too many hurdles. It is an honor to introduce our guests, who may interpret Pakistan's economic crisis and shed light on possible solutions for the country's quagmire of rising sovereign debt and the difficulties in achieving economic stability. This panel features Dr. Reza Baqir and Mr. Ali Farid Khwaja. Dr. Reza Baqir served as the 20th Governor of the State Bank of Pakistan from May 2019 to May 2022. He is currently a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and Managing Director at Alvarez and Marsal. He led several institutional reforms, including the liberalization of Pakistan's foreign exchange market from a fixed to a flexible regime, revision of the central bank law to strengthen its independence, Roshan digital accounts for overseas Pakistanis, and several digitization initiatives to promote efficiency and inclusion in the financial sector. Prior to public service in his home country, Dr. Baqir spent 19 years with the IMF and 2 with the World Bank, where he held numerous senior policy and country positions in East Asia, Middle East, and Europe. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley and an AB in economics from Harvard University. Our discussant, Ali Farid Khwaja, is the chairman of Khadim Ali Shah Bukhari Securities, a leading stock brokerage in Pakistan. He also works as a consultant for the Asian Development Bank and Bank Al Falah, and serves as an advisor to the Prism Group, a Swiss private equity fund, as well as the Osiris Group based in Hong Kong. He has been a top-ranked technology analyst in Europe at Berenberg Bank and the Union Bank of Switzerland. Mr. Ali Farid Khwaja is a chartered financial analyst and holds an MSc in financial economics from Oxford. He has also completed a BSc in economics and computer science from LUMS in Pakistan. Dr. Nilanjan Sarkar is the academic chair for this panel. Now, before we begin the session, I would like to take the opportunity to highlight specific rules and regulations which are in effect throughout the duration of this event. First and foremost, no sharp objects or political symbols such as flags and banners are allowed inside the venue. If they are found to be in your possession, they can be confiscated. Furthermore, photography or audio and video recordings of the session are not permitted. Additionally, no food and drink is allowed inside the venue. Finally, we reserve the right to refuse entry to anyone or remove anyone from the audience who we may consider a security threat or may otherwise attempt to derail event proceedings. With that out of the way, we hope to have an insightful discussion, and we are honored to host Dr. Reza Baqir and Mr. Ali Farid Khwaja at the 2023 LSE Future of Pakistan Conference. Over to you, Mr. Khwaja.
Thank you. And it's absolutely my honor to be hosting Dr. Baqir and a pleasure to be at your university. I went to Oxford, but I must say that I'm envious of your library. It's much better than the library I spent time at Oxford. And it's a great honor to be talking to Dr. Baqir. I'm a big fan of his, especially the change you brought at State Bank. I think you made it much more open. You were far more interactive. You provided a lot more data. So as analysts, as market participants, we were very happy with the change you brought. And of course, a big fan of your initiatives such as Roshan Digital, which of course helped all of us as overseas Pakistanis and enabled us to participate in Pakistan's economy. But as some of you might know, that 5 years ago, I invested money in Pakistan to launch K-Trade, KSB, And we've also invested in music and co-working spaces and medtech. So now I also speak as a concerned Pakistani, especially on this topic of sustainable growth and sovereign debt. So I'm really excited about this session and asking Dr. Baqir some questions. The format, we have 1.5 hours for this session. So the format would be that I'll ask him some of the questions which I've prepared for the first 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will be open for questions. For questions, please do tell your name and your organization before asking the question. So Dr. Baqir, kicking off with the first question, you have been the country head of IMF for Egypt, a country which also deals with sovereign debt problems. You were head of the debt team at IMF, and then of course you were the governor of the central bank. So how do we achieve sustainable growth? And then all of these, how do we achieve sustainable growth while dealing with the debt issue?
Thank you, Ali. Assalamu alaikum. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me thank the organizers, and let me also say that last night I had the occasion to have dinner with the organizers, and I was really impressed, really excited to see all the talent that is at this school. And before we get into all the topics of sustainable growth and sovereign debt and all the related issues, I wanted to just get one message out. Since I'm at a university and there are a lot of talent in this room, and the message that I wanted to get out was that make sure that at some occasion in your professional life, I'm addressing the students in particular, you try to do public service. I did public service, always wanted to, never knew when I would have the opportunity to do it. But when I got the opportunity, although it was a big decision to quit a cushy job like the IMF that protects you forever, but that was probably the best decision, the best opportunity that came. So it doesn't matter what is the opportunity. It doesn't matter whether your role is big or small, but if you get the opportunity, and you can make your opportunities because you have your professional life in front of you, seize that. And for some stage of your career, try public service. I feel it's the best thing that you can do. Let's get on to more serious things such as sustainable growth, why Pakistan has not had sustainable growth, and also sovereign debt. And I want to begin by maybe talking a little bit about what, in my view, are not the answers, but are commonly put forward as the reasons why we have problems with sustainable growth, why, as it was said in the introduction, we've had repeated international bailouts, and why our debt is so high. And in particular, I want to single out 3 myths that are propagated. And the first myth is that there is some kind of a conspiracy against Pakistan, that various nefarious dark forces have come together and orchestrated a plan that very few people know about, and it just doesn't let us grow in a sustainable manner. Often this is linked with the fact that Pakistan has nuclear weapons and so forth. And I want to say at least that, in my view, it's not even worth having that discussion. It's just a reflection of us wanting to displace the problem and not taking ownership of the problem. The second myth I want to put forward, that again I find is a national pastime, is to blame international institutions. And the poster child of this blame game is the IMF. It is all the IMF's fault. That's why Pakistan has not been able to have sustainable growth. Again, that is just a blame game. It's just shifting the responsibility to the actual issue. And the last myth I want to dispel at the very beginning is that, and I used to hear that a lot, that Pakistan is unique. Our problems are peculiar. and it needs a very, very customized solution. And it's not. Most of the problems that we've had and that have prevented us to grow in a sustainable manner, it is not rocket science. So I just wanted to get out at the very beginning that please watch out for these three myths that are often propagated but are just convenient ways for us to ignore the real questions as to why we have not been able to grapple with our problems. And they are our problems, and we have to take ownership of our own problems. Now, sustainable growth and debt. People often think that if you have high debt, you can't have sustainable growth. And in Pakistan, if you look at the IMF numbers, and I use the IMF just because, they're often taken to be one of the more reliable sources. If you look at the most recent World Economic Outlook or the IMF's website, you will see our debt somewhere between 70 and 75% of GDP. That's last fiscal year's data. And if you look at our growth, it's oscillated, average maybe around 3% or so. Now, if you look at our neighbor to the east, and I mention this just because it gets people's juices flowing if you compare Pakistan to our neighbor. Well, their debt is about 10 percentage points of GDP higher than Pakistan. And their growth is also a few percentage points higher than Pakistan, especially over the last decade. So it's not just the case that if you have high debt, you can't grow, because you have an example right next doors. So for us, what is it about the nature of our debt or other aspects of our economy that leads us to have balance of payments crises whenever we grow? First thing is that a non-trivial amount of our debt is debt in foreign currency. That's not the case in many countries that grow with stability despite high debt. Now, why is that important? Of itself, it would not be important if the management of a country's reserves were such that having debt in foreign currency did not lead to sharp falls in reserves. But for us, that reliance on foreign currency debt, and particularly the debt by the public sector, by the government borrowing, is the first cause of why our debt profile is such that our debt stock leads us to problems. The second, in my view, is a historic fascination with fixed exchange rates. Now, recently, we've moved away from it, but for a big part of our history, there was this obsession about the exchange rate. And when you fix exchange rates, and especially when they get overvalued, if you grow, it is going to lead to current account deficits. And for us, therefore, unlike our neighbor, whenever we grow, we get current account deficits that are hard to finance. And that's another reason why we get repeated financial crises and other countries don't. In May of 2019, one of the first things that I had to do when I joined the central bank was to float the rupee and to make it market-based. And we've had an evolution since, and until recently, the rupee used to have orderly two-way movements. And the reason I mention this is that it's important is that when you have a lot of external borrowing and you face pressures on the current account deficit, the only natural shock absorber of that is the exchange rate. And if that is not allowed to adjust, then you are going to have episodes of growth with current account deficits and balance of payments problems. And the last point that I want to mention is a historic reliance on central bank borrowing from the government. When countries run deficits, it's very tempting that instead of borrowing at market rates, you borrow from the central bank. After all, it seems pretty natural to say that if I am the government and I need to borrow just because there are so many important sources of expenditure, and you know, these commercial banks, they are sharks and they are charging really high interest rates. But guess what? I have my central bank, and I, as the government, own my central bank. So why not borrow from the central bank? We've been doing this historically. And it's a really commonly believed argument. But we never pause to think that if it were so easy to finance government deficits by simply borrowing from the central bank, why wouldn't every single country do that? And I think the realization that comes slowly is that central bank borrowing is inflationary. And when a government repeatedly borrows from the central bank, it creates balance of payments pressures in turn, and it creates inflation. So again, as of 2019, de facto, it wasn't in the law then, but de facto, since June of 2019, on a flow basis, the central bank did not lend a rupee to the government. And then it was codified in the law that was reformed as well. So let me stop by just saying that, look, just debt by itself is not necessarily a problem. You'll find many countries in the world that have higher debt than Pakistan. But if you have debt where a significant portion is foreign currency denominated and it is borrowing by the government, it'll have to be repaid out of reserves. If it is going to have to be repaid out of reserves, it's very important for you to have an exchange rate policy where current account deficits are not financed by reserves, but you let the exchange rate to adjust. And that you refrain, you stop yourself from the temptation of borrowing from the central bank when you run large deficits. So let me stop there, and I'm sure there'll be variants of this question that will come up in the conversation.
I'm sure, and especially the exchange rate, which you mentioned. So you said three main reasons why Pakistan is struggling. One is the nature of the debt, the second is bad exchange rate policy, and secondly, central bank borrowing. Are we stuck with all because of all three of these problems, or is there any way forward of getting out of this trap?
So let me first answer the question at a broader level. I think, you know, we can get into the specific reasons why we get budget deficits sustained over a long periods of time. We can speak about why our exports to GDP ratio is very low and doesn't generate enough foreign exchange for us to be able to pay our foreign obligations. But I want to take a step back, first of all. And I want to talk a little bit about why have we, despite having so many smart Pakistani economists and policymakers and technocrats, why have we not been able to put together our own reform program that we think is going to be able to address the issues that we face? And you know, everything that I'm going to share with you is not rocket science. You know, these are very, very straightforward, well understood answers to the problems that we have. So I want to start off with the bigger question that why do we in Pakistan not come together to create our own reform program? And why do we delay it? That it's only an institution like the IMF will come and have to put together a reform program for us. So that's the fundamental question. And it's not as though it can't be done. And I want to give examples. I want to give an example from a country that I personally experienced the transformation, and a country very, very similar to Pakistan, a country that used to have high debt, a country where state-owned enterprises were a big part of the country's fiscal problems, a country where the politics was dysfunctional, where corruption was rampant, but it transformed itself. A country that, like Pakistan, used to be called a prolonged user of fund resources, which is a technical term in IMF jargon. Very few countries have that distinction. Pakistan is one of them. And the country I'm talking about is the Philippines. And I used to live in Manila for 3 years as then the IMF head of the office over there. And I remember this is the mid 2000s. Back at that time, the IMF was very concerned that the Philippines was going to have a full blown crisis. And the IMF was ready with the program. I thought any day the call would come. And then the IMF would have to learn to the Philippines. And I remember when I went out there, people were so pessimistic about the Philippines. And I remember the comment from one analyst in particular who told me, oh, you've come to a great country. You know what's really famous about the Philippines? Is they know how to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. This was the view on that country, right? It sounds almost like Pakistan, that we know how to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And then, facing this crisis, mid 2005, a group of Filipino economists came together. Themselves, some of the leading professors at the universities, some technocrats, some retired bureaucrats, mostly a non-partisan group. And they put together a paper called The Fiscal Crisis Facing the Philippines. They themselves went and they lobbied and they pitched both sides of the political space. And they urged the bureaucrats and the politicians to get behind it. Well, guess what? 80% of the content of that paper was actually very similar to what the IMF was saying. But the fact that it was a non-partisan plan that was put together by Filipino economists, it was much easier for the then government, for the then president, to get behind that plan than to get behind an IMF plan. And they actually did it. And I still remember the day when they did it. And it was very similar things. They recommended raising the value-added tax rate. They recommended broadening the base. They recommended taxation of energy. You could read that script as though you're talking about Pakistan. But when they came together, and it had the political ownership, and they did it, Philippines has never had an IMF program since. Furthermore, the turnaround was so dramatic that in a year and a half from there, I'm talking about summer of 2005, December of 2006, I get a call on the 23rd of December from the then Deputy Governor of the Banco Central Pilipinas, the Central Bank of Philippines, saying, Reza, how are you doing? We had a meeting with the President of the Philippines yesterday. She has decided to give a Christmas gift to the country. You know, they celebrate Christmas in a very big way, and there's nothing bigger than giving a Christmas gift. And she's decided to prepay all IMF obligations in one go. And I am, the Deputy Governor talking to me, I am calling you because we want you to make sure that this payment gets processed today, because she's going to go on TV on Christmas Eve, and then she's going to announce to the whole country that this is my gift to you. I have prepaid all IMF obligations. So talk about, the point I'm making is that you have examples of ownership, and you have examples of how people come together themselves. They take ownership. They don't believe in false myths. And when you do that, you have the head of a government standing proud on TV and saying, not only are we not going to borrow, actually now, you know, we've settled all our debts in one go, a payment of several $1 billion. Now, I want to give an example from our own history that I had the occasion to witness. When I think Pakistan came together, and it prevailed, and it got recognized as an international success story as well. And that's the COVID crisis, the largest crisis that the global economy has faced since World War II, because it was a crisis of public health. And you know, you can't kill germs with interest rates or with stimulus. And people were scared. And Pakistan is and was globally recognized as a success story on all three dimensions. What are the three dimensions? The public health dimension. If you look at the data on the number of COVID cases per capita, the number of COVID deaths per capita, if you look at the positivity rate, which is the number of PCR tests that return positive, which is the hardest figure to fudge, you may be able to fudge the other. Pakistan had one of the lowest numbers in each wave of the COVID crisis. Scored really well on the public health dimension. Second thing was social programs, cash transfer programs to try to get money to the poor. And the ESAS program that was then run by Dr. Sania Nishtar was a brilliant program recognized by institutions like the World Bank and others for how well targeted it was, how quick it was, and how much money it got to the people that really needed it in a targeted manner. And then finally, on the economic side, Pakistan is one of those few countries in the world that between 2020 and 2021 reduces its public debt to GDP by 7 percentage points of GDP through the COVID crisis, while most countries increase their debt to GDP ratio. It reduced its primary deficit as well. On the central bank side, we came up with a number of innovative measures to support lives and livelihoods so that people don't get fired from their jobs. Roshan Digital Account was born at that time because we wanted to mobilize and tap into the diaspora. That initiative generated, I think to date, $5.5 billion. Imagine going from 0 to 5.5 billion. That's more than the IMF has lent in this program to Pakistan. And a number of things came together for Pakistan to be recognized that it did well during the largest crisis of the global economy. So my point is that we have examples from other countries that have taken ownership. We have, I believe, in my view, example from our own history where we came together in the face of a very, very severe crisis and worked together to pull the country out of that. So that, to me, the main message is that we have it within us, right? And you know what I'm reminded of, and that is, I think, what's most painful for me to see, is that if a people, few tens or 100 or, few tens of millions, could in the 1940s gain independence for us, my fathers, your grandfathers, I think, recognizing the age difference, if their sacrifices, if they were able to create a homeland for Pakistan despite such adverse circumstances, getting a handle over our economic problems, these problems that I'm talking about, which is not rocket science, by comparison should not be that hard if we take ownership and if we stop believing that these are conspiracies, and if we get away from the blame game and every one of us asks what in our capacity can we do to support a reform program that is owned by Pakistan and that is deliberated amongst Pakistani economists, preferably in a non-partisan way, so that it's broad-based. And then our own political leaders, I think, will find it easier to get behind it.
Indeed, an indigenous reform program with ownership. I remember you even wrote an op-ed on this topic arguing that Pakistan needs that. But I must thank you for giving those positive examples of recent success stories of policy action in Pakistan, because I feel that there's so much pessimism that perhaps a lot of people have given up. They think that we can't have success. So thank you for reminding us of some really, really monumental and recent examples where Pakistan's economic policy has been extremely successful. And with that, I want to jump to some specific examples of policies which we can take both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side. So perhaps we can start with the fiscal side. Yeah. What are your suggestions for some specific policies?
Look, so, when we talk on the fiscal side and what the government can do to stop these repeated boom-bust cycles, to me there are always three factors that are extremely important. And the first and foremost is on the taxation side. And it's not a, very deep point to note that if we are not able to collect enough resources from people who can afford to and should pay their taxes, we are not going to be able to have enough resources to be able to provide for all the social and infrastructure needs that we need to provide for a country of 220 million people. When the IMF program was negotiated back in 2019, the tax to GDP ratio then was around 10% of GDP. It was, one of the lowest in the region. And at 10% of GDP, you can't have enough resources to pay for all the needs that the country has. That tax to GDP ratio, look at the IMF staff report from 2019. It's all available on the website, so I'm not saying anything secretive. That tax to GDP ratio was supposed to have reached 15% of GDP by now in the fiscal year 2023. Well, guess what it is? It's 10% of GDP. And guess how much are our interest payments in percent of GDP right now? They're nearly 5% of GDP. So you have 5% of GDP left to do everything. Now, to me, addressing this problem is not through continuing to squeeze those people who are already in the tax net. Yes, there is a role for making sure that people who are already in the tax net are not fudging their tax returns. But the far bigger problem is that the base is very narrow. You have heard statistics of how many people are registered as taxpayers. You have heard statistics of important big sections of the business community that are not in the tax net. It is very politically costly to go after those. It is very easy to go after the salaried class that is getting tax deducted at source to increase the burden on them. It's very easy to raise indirect taxes, which is inflationary and disproportionately has more of a burden on those who are not as well off. So first, I would say widen the base, bring into the tax net that we all know are not in the tax net. And in fact, if that is done in a manner that is very politically costly, and if that is done in a manner where those who are going to be taxed come out in protest, well, then you know that you're really going after those who you need to go after, who are not in the tax net. And it's not fair to those who are already paying taxes. The second thing I wanted to mention about what can the government do to avoid these repeated boom bust cycles is exports. Historically, including through an overvalued exchange rate in the past, we have had a policy where we have not put exports first and foremost. And until we have an explicit focus on that, not only through a market-based exchange rate, but also how do we increase the capacity, the supply capacity of exports, and how do we get our businesses to be a little bit more adventurous than just exporting textiles? You know better than I do, the Pakistani businessmen, there are lots of very, very successful businessmen. But how many of them are diversifying into other areas of export growth? I used to have repeated conversations with many of these groups saying there is a concept in economics called economies of scope, different from economies of scale. Economies of scale is if you produce at a much larger level, the cost per capita go down. The economies of scope concept is that if you have one big business and you start another one, a lot of the costs are shared costs such as HR, accounting, and you are well positioned to try something new. So how many of our traditional exporters have started something new? You have to really, really search hard to get examples. But we have to go down that road. And the best people to do that are people who are already well-established exporters because of economies of scope. Some examples that I find very, very refreshing is, I think one industrial group put up a factory for exporting tires. So right now, I believe a service group, Pakistani manufactured truck tires are being exported to the US. American trucks are using Pakistani-made tires. Many other areas where we should be exporting more, and it's not just a matter of exchange rate. We need a conscious policy where export diversification has to be. Our export to GDP ratio right now is less than 10% of GDP. Has to at least double. And the last point I want to come to is our savings rate. And the fact that we don't save in productive ways, i.e. we don't save in ways in which that savings can be intermediated into investment. but rather a typical form of saving is real estate and typically is buying plots of land. And part of that problem is our taxation system. And there are some other reasons as well, which I should not mention, otherwise I'll get into trouble. And until somebody takes on that very hot potato as well and gives people an incentive, or at least levels the playing field, that whether you invest in real estate or in some way in which those savings will be intermediated into investment, your taxation is going to be the same, and you're not going to be able to be in the informal economy in one and be in the formal economy of the other, we're going to continue to have current account deficits. And so, just in summary, on the government side, a more coherent, a more fair strategy on taxation, focusing on widening the base, not just increasing the tax rates. A strategy on figuring out how do we diversify and grow our export base, and how do we really encourage our businessmen who are very, very successful at what they do to take the risks to diversify? How do we reward that? And finally, on the savings side, how do we have incentives and a taxation system and other system of carrots and sticks so that people save in productive ways that lead to financing of investment without current account deficits, as opposed to saving in ways that the money just stays in the informal economy?
Well, thank you for mentioning those 3 points: tax, exports, and savings. And I must mention over here that I think some of the steps you took as the governor of the central bank for exports, especially for tech exports, were critical. And as as an investor in the tech sector, your policies of allowing the OPCO holdco structure, that was critical for getting investment into Pakistan. And so must thank you for that. But even more importantly, when you were at helm of affairs, it felt for tech investors and entrepreneurs that State Bank understood the pains and was a willing ear to listen to them and then take action to enable the change. So I must mention that, because I think that was a really, really critical policy and the implementation which enabled that whole sector to grow in the last 3 years.
Shall I tell you an anecdote about it?
Please do.
So, when I joined the State Bank of Pakistan, I, until that time, had been, working at the IMF for nearly 20 years, and, running a central bank in, large and complicated emerging market, nothing prepares you for then. And I used to have this experience where a lot of smart people like you, especially in the tech area, would come to me, those who, happen to have my number, and constantly ask me or complain about state bank regulations that were preventing them from being able to do business. Now, I'm not an IT person. And for that matter, also, a lot of the minutiae about foreign exchange regulations are not things that you really get into if you're running an organization. But I was disturbed by one question, which was that if smart people are repeatedly coming and saying that there is something that a central bank can do which will not cost the central bank much, why is the dialogue not happening? And then when I would ask my colleagues in the state bank, they would tell me, sir, inko nahi pata. We know more. And ye aapko trick karne ki koshish kar rahe hain. These people are trying to trick you. And they're going to hoodwink you, and they're going to take money out of Pakistan. So, I didn't know the answers, but what I did was I created a group led by the director of the then Exchange Policy Department, and I said, in this group, let's put some representatives from the IT side, from the venture capital funds, from others, and I would like that you, together with your colleagues, talking to my colleague, have a series of meetings with them. And let's just have an open mind, because, again, talking from the perspective of running an organization, wanted to encourage my colleagues to feel that we don't have the monopoly over good ideas. Right? There can be good ideas, and there are good ideas in the private sector. So let's just listen with an open mind. 90% of those ideas that came from the industry. And, they would eventually percolate up to me, and I would say to my colleagues that, just have an open mind. And in the end, that's what we put forward. And I was happy to see that even my own colleagues then saw that actually some of their suspicions about people asking for relaxations were not as well founded as perhaps, and I don't blame them because as a regulator, it's a thankless job because if you end up in a situation where some flexibility that you gave ends up being abused, and Pakistanis are very good at abusing a well-intentioned law, and we've had so much examples of the regulations being abused to buy condos abroad and apartments abroad, and the regulators were all petrified that they do something for the IT side, and instead of IT, it's leading to buying property abroad. But we did it, and I was very happy to see then the investment that came. But I'm reminded of the story, right? How did we? I didn't know the answers. All I said was, let's create a group. You meet every month. I want to be updated, and periodically I would join the meeting myself. And if you have a reasonable amount of common sense, you figure out if there is a smart idea that is being presented. So sorry, I wanted to just share an anecdote of that.
No, thank you for that, and I will follow up with that to ask you that, what else can State Bank do to support the fiscal policy? But before that, I'll also, just for the audience, because I think you guys won't know this, so the State Bank has this foreign exchange policy, the FE manual, which for them was this red line, and the thing which they were most concerned about. So the rule was that if you as a foreign investor would invest in a Pakistani company, when you're selling your investment, you can only sell it at book value,
Right.
at your value of your assets. So imagine in tech where there is no asset and you are investing in multiples of book value, you are investing at, let's say, 10 times, and you can only sell at 1 time book value. So it was a non-starter, so hence I was giving him credit because had that rule not been changed, and I can tell you that State Bank was in no mood to have a conversation, and there was no channel for conversation to be in the first place, except if you know his number, which I didn't. So then there wouldn't have been any tech investments in Pakistan. So I just thought it's important to share that with the audience because I didn't know that there was such a rule before I decided to invest in Pakistan, and only after I made the investment, people told me, by the way, you do know that you're investing, but when you sell, you can only sell at a loss. So
we changed that rule as well.
You did.
And what we changed was an idea that came from the industry again.
What more can State Bank do?
Yeah. So I think the role of a central bank in general to promote sustainable growth is twofold. I think one is on the macro stability side. And I mentioned already the importance of having a market-based exchange rate. I mentioned already the importance of not lending to the government for financing deficits. And there are related areas in that as well to maintain financial stability. And I should say that Pakistan, on the issue of financial stability, is not had any major banking crisis. Unlike many other countries that have sovereign debt crises, Pakistan's debt crises typically, or balance of payments crises, are just on the foreign exchange side, have not been associated with banking crises. I think there is something else that is very important that a central bank can do in a country like Pakistan. And on this, I learned it, which is to gear the banking system more towards productive growth. The other thing that I discovered in my job was that commercial banks were not necessarily geared towards making the life of the average customer easy. And they were not necessarily geared towards helping people invest. And they were not necessarily geared towards lending to SMEs. And they were not necessarily geared towards promoting entrepreneurship or innovation. And there is a role that the central bank can play over there. Now, what are those things that one can do? Roshan Digital Account was one such idea, which was how can we generate additional foreign exchange for the country from nothing? And it had three very, very simple ideas behind it, and all possible, but just we just needed to come together and take also a little bit of risk to try it. One was digital onboarding. Digital onboarding means that if you as a customer want to open a bank account, you don't have to physically be present. Technology now allows, through video capture and through reading your fingerprints and with appropriate protocols, that customer due diligence can be done remotely. Number two, repatriation. That if you bring money from outside into a Russian digital account, you don't need any permission from the State Bank of Pakistan to take that money out. That was a fight I had to fight internally, because the prevailing wisdom was that we should make it very easy to bring money in and make it hard to take money out. And the big discussion that I had, didn't do it until we had ownership within the State Bank, was that we are putting the cart before the horse if we think that way. Because it's only when we tell them that we will not ask, and it will not be in the state banks, we will not have to even ask for a permission. Until we do that, nobody's going to bring money. And the last thing for which I had to lobby hard the corridors of power in Islamabad was on the FBR side. It was critical that taxation on any money that you bring in on the Russian digital account be full and final, which means that 10% would be deducted at source, the 10% on the profit or whatever income you make. But full and final means that once that amount is deducted, you no longer have any obligation to the FBR, because the fear of any overseas Pakistani is कि बैठे बिठाए FBR पीछे पड़ गई. Yeah, I have to now file a tax return there as well, right? These three concepts, they're very simple, but they were key. Involved a little bit of innovation, taking some risk, but that's where a central bank could help, because it could mobilize additional funding. Another area, I think, is on the side of inclusion and digitization, because these are things that grow the formal part of the economy and eventually will lead to more people coming into the tax net as well, or that's not how we used to pitch it. But we introduced a faster payment system called RAST. Faster payment system is a technical term, which means that unlike IBFT, interbank fund transfer, which costs some money, faster payments is a payments within seconds. Within 10 seconds, according to the regulation, the amount that is debited from a customer's account has to be credited. And we call this RAST. And we launched RAST in my time primarily to promote digitization, with the goal that with it will come new opportunities for growth. So these are just some examples, but there are examples. So my bigger point is that a central bank as a regulator can use its regulatory powers to get banks to be a bit more helpful to particularly small businessmen, particularly to innovators, particularly to SMEs. There are many other examples, but I won't go into that. But that's where I feel that a central bank in a country like Pakistan needs to be a bit forward-leaning.
No, absolutely. And Russian Digital, I think, was truly transformative. I can again speak from a personal example. So with K-Trade, which is a stock trading app through which people can invest in stocks, if overseas Pakistanis, prior to Russian Digital, wanted to open an account, they had to go to the embassy, get all the certificates notarized from there. Before that, they had to go to a public notary. So you had to find a public notary, pay him £1,000, get it notarized, then go to the Foreign Office, UK Foreign Office, to get it stamped by them, then go to Pakistan Embassy. So if you were in some other city, Oxford, for example, or Cambridge, you had to come to London, get time, and then get it notarized from there, apostilled from there, and then send all of your documents. So it was, I had to request people that, please do it, and not many people would listen to that request. With Russian Digital now, it was all seamless. Within 10 minutes, people could open an account and invest in Pakistani companies. So certainly I saw how big that change was, and you mentioned the number that $5 billion came because of it. So I wasn't sure if people knew how bad things were prior to that, so I thought it was important to highlight that. And also Dr. Baqir mentioned this thing about an indigenous reform agenda, and I think that it's really important for all of you in the audience, for being students of economics at LSE and universities in the UK, to be a part of that. And again, he mentioned 3 points. The third point, which was about getting savings into productive assets. I think that's really, really important, something which is very, very close to my heart. Dr. Baqir, we have perhaps 10 minutes before we open for, 5 minutes before we open up for Q&A to the audience. And I know that you wanted to avoid any kind of dangerous questions. But let me ask you two slightly more perhaps controversial questions. The first is this whole debate about state bank autonomy, and perhaps right now, and I'm just trying to be careful about the words I say, but perhaps now with our current regime, it feels to people that state bank is being run by the Ministry of Finance, perhaps the Turkish model where the state bank, Ministry of Finance runs that. But when you were at helm of affairs, you were pushing and recommending independence of the central bank. And I hear that debate a lot academically as well, that should state bank be independent or should state bank be perhaps managed by the MOF? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, I want to just make clear that, there is a lot of debate about this right now. I think we should have a debate with respect. I think it is unfortunate when we lose respect and we make things personal. We talk about people rather than policies. And I have a lot of respect for my successor, who is in the governor's office right now. And he used to be a deputy governor when I was a governor. And I think any office holder, whether it's a minister of finance, any minister, any central bank governor, we need to always show respect to each other and have debates on policies and not make it about people. But often, we just, in fact, make people's names as part of the policy. And I think that is not helpful for us as a society. The theme is polarization. And I think when we make things personal, it just makes things more polarized. So in my time, we pushed successfully legislation for the State Bank Act to revise it, to give it more de jure independence. And by de jure, I mean independence on paper, in the law. And that was, in my view, an extremely important bill because it needed to formalize a few things that we were practicing. And one of those things was no lending to the government. And that the reason for that I explained already, because it would impose more fiscal discipline. It also clarified the objectives of the state bank, that number one, that the objective of growth should come after the objectives of financial and price stability. But the independence of the central bank does not mean that the central bank is not accountable. The central bank is owned by the government. And what central bank independence means that the goals of a central bank are defined by the government. And that is clear. And that is in the law. But what central bank independence means that once the government has defined the goals for the central bank, then the central bank has autonomy in the running of its affairs to achieve those goals. And periodically, it is the central bank that is held accountable and asked to explain how well is it achieving those goals. Unfortunately, the way this whole discussion was characterized was, again, a sinister plot against Pakistan to sell the State Bank of Pakistan to the IMF. That's how it was characterized. And the very, very sort of appealing logic that if the State Bank of Pakistan is the bank of the government of Pakistan, then why should it not lend to the government of Pakistan? And that law got passed. It was criticized by the then opposition. I'm talking about the previous, not this year, the previous year. And I'm very glad that it passed. But if I could have, one wish, I think it would be that it would have been great to have more national discourse in a less polarizing manner, because it got very politicized. And I would not want that law passed unless I felt that there had been enough organic social debate in universities elsewhere that this law should be passed only if it is in the interest of Pakistan. I'm convinced that central bank independence is in the interest of not just Pakistan, many other countries like Pakistan. But I also am of the view that unless we get their ownership, we won't have the de jure independence of the central bank. So having independence on paper doesn't mean that you will have it in practice. And then there has been a lot of commentary recently when such a large gap opened up between the interbank exchange rate and the black market exchange rate of 50, 60 rupees. I, having been a central banker before, I remember in those days when there was such a large gap, I was going abroad, so I'm entitled to buy a few $1,000s. And the difference in the rates that I was being quoted, it was astounding. And I thought, I should tweet about it. Maybe it will bring attention. And then I thought I should actually keep my head low and not do any tweets, because it's good when things are not going well to keep a low profile as well. But that was, the difference between the official rate, the interbank rate, and the rate in the open market. So that whole concept of a market-based exchange rate, was being questioned, and it was being questioned especially then, by people who thought that these reforms were there to stick. And so when we did something, but then it came back, I think reflects the fact that we should do laws when there is a lot of organic discussion with ownership, and repeatedly have these discussions and have discussions based on evidence in a scientific manner rather than based upon conspiracy theories.
No, thank you for that, and that has been a theme for what you have said, which is responsibility and an inclusive policy making with stakeholders. And thank you for also mentioning respectful debate. You started off the conversation by saying that we should be you are respectful of your people who followed you, and I fear that in Pakistan our debate is becoming too polarized and too critical. I have a lot more questions to ask you, but perhaps the questions will come from the audience, and we have 20 minutes for Q&A. So, yes. So Alim just came to remind me on that. So let's start with questions. I want to see some woman hand on the audience as well. So why not start with you? Dawn.
We can, yes.
Hello, I'm Atika Rahman. I'm Dawn's UK correspondent. My question's for you, Dr. Baqir. Like you said, what you're saying is not rocket science. It's been done by others before, other countries before. It's evident that we need to improve our export industry, that we need an indigenous reforms program. But surely our political leaders are not oblivious to this. They know what needs to be done. But there's something stopping them. What, in your opinion, is stopping them? And have you seen examples of these initiatives, attempts to launch such initiatives, and have you seen why they failed? If you can just point to some of the gaps. Thank you.
So, look, I should not comment on the strengths and weaknesses of the political system per se. I'm been trained as an economist and was a central banker, so I'm not necessarily qualified to comment on that. But I will say or share my thoughts on what can be done. I think political parties will only help themselves if they themselves are perceived as promoting a nationally driven process. If they can support people to come together and produce economic reform, even if they produce a forum where such dialogue can occur, and ideally in a non-partisan manner. There are others who could do that. For instance, the business community could do that. I've never understood why the business community shies away from being more forward-leaning and supporting groups that can be non-partisan and technical and support economists. There are some industry groups like the Pakistan Business Council, but such groups are largely seen as lobbying groups that are trying to get certain, provisions passed, and there is always a suspicion that it is in the interest of that industry per se. And also, what they produce is not through a organic process. They probably hire some consultant, and that consultant produces some report. I think the process is as important as the content. Remember, in the Philippines, what they came up with was not rocket science, but it was the process that they themselves came up with. They themselves had discussions, and there were a diversity of views. But you have to go through that to own it. And I think parties, by supporting such debate, by saying unequivocally that we will not mind whatever conclusions you come up with, but we support a forum where such debate can happen. The business community and others, stakeholders, whoever is in a position of power. And I think many of you in the audience, many of you, I think, would have good ideas. I especially want to, reach out to, the youth using social media and other channels to think of ways in which you can be agents of change, whether it's a small or a big level. And, do not be afraid of failure. Do not be afraid of trying something just because you might fail. If that's the philosophy we would have followed in the state bank, we would not have had Roshan digital accounts. We would not have had many other initiatives as well, right? So the message that I want to really convey when I talk about ownership is that if we are really motivated to get a grip on our own future, then we have to think ourselves, what is it that I can do? Instead of saying that that person is not doing what they should be doing.
Thank you for that. Let's move to the next question. Right at the back. Yes, please.
Hi, so my name's Amin, a student at LSE. Thank you, Dr. Reza, for the talk. It was really, really insightful. My question is that I think you mentioned a lot about how the Roshan digital account has made a huge impact, but you spoke about the impact in the context of attracting foreign investment, increasing towards the stock market, etc. But what about I know Pakistan has a very large unbanked population, for example, and a lot of people can't really invest in the stock market. Either they don't have the income for it or they don't have the education. So what can be done at that grassroots level to what macroeconomic policy or micro policy can we take to improve that sort of reform?
Thank you. I'm sure financial inclusion is close to your heart. So.
Yeah. So look, of the things that a central bank can do, we were talking earlier about what a central bank can do to promote growth in a country. And I think your question really refers to what can be done to promote financial inclusion. And there is a lot to be done, and we are way behind. But I also want to point out some of the things that were done. And what is very, very frustrating for me is the recognition that people don't know about it. And to realize or to state this to you, that all of these are well-kept secrets on the State Bank's website. Okay? Now, one of the areas that always used to pain me was women's financial inclusion. Okay? Pakistan scores one of the lowest in the world in terms of the gender gap in financial inclusion of women. And it's not clear why. Because some people would say it's for cultural or religious reasons. But guess what? Similar countries with the same religion have a much smaller gender gap. Whether you look at Saudi Arabia, you look at Iran, you look at Turkey, you look at Malaysia, you look at Indonesia, their indices of inclusion for women are much better. So we then did the regulatory interventions and used digitization. And now let me tell you a secret that's on our website. That if you have, and this is not just for women, if you have a smartphone And if you have a national identity card, you can open a bank account sitting in the privacy of your room. And we did this primarily with the goal to encourage women to open bank accounts because, for various reasons, including cultural reasons, including the behavior of often bank branch employees, including transportation costs for many low-income women to go, and take some kind of transportation to a bank branch, that for accounts with the balance up to a certain amount, but enough for most of the lower middle income class people, that you can open a bank account in the privacy of your room. You don't even need a declaration of income, because many women, that journey would stop because the bank would say, bring a statement of your income. And if she was not working, if she was a housewife, or she was not married, that statement would have to come from her husband or her father, and it would have to be a statement that I give such and such person so much money monthly. That would be a showstopper, right? So we did that. We did the regulatory changes. We brought together NADRA and PTA and others to allow the remote biometric on the bank's apps. But then just doing it was not enough. The banks would not be aggressive about going out and communicating it. It's their job. They are the ones who are getting the customers. And so then we would have to go to get after the banks and tell them that we want to see you put out ads. We want to see you onboarding women customers. But how much can the regulator do if in fact, why wasn't Roshan Digital account created by the commercial banks themselves? Why didn't a commercial bank come to the central bank and say, we have a great idea, this will net you a few billion dollars? So my frustration with a few of these things was that, or I think the learning, I should say, was that communication is a very, very important part when you want to make an intervention for inclusion. And we did RAST, which is a payment system. It's free. I encourage you to use it. Other forms of bank transfers have hidden charges. RAST does not. And your mobile number is your alias, so you don't even need to know the bank account of the person you're sending money to. Just your mobile number, you can send money. These were all interventions for inclusion, but creating the regulatory framework and enabling the technology was not enough. There was a big part of it, which is how to effectively communicate so that the message gets out to people. So I gave just an example of women, but another key sector that's included is SMEs. So we came up with another program, and that is called SAF. And SAF stands for clean, and clean lending is a technical term in finance, which is lending without collateral. Many SMEs banks will not lend to them because banks will ask for collateral, and many SMEs don't have collateral. And guess what? It's not rocket science to lend on the basis of the cash flows of a company rather than collateral. Many other countries are doing it. So we came up with this program that gave some incentives for banks to launch their programs to lend to SMEs without requiring collateral. That also got started very successfully. But again, I think if there was something that should be done more, was more on the effective communication of it and asking ourselves, why are we failing in getting the message out that these things are available to people?
No, absolutely. I was told that we have a hard stop at 3:20, so we only have 5 minutes left. Because the question was about stock market, I'll just add that in 2018, if you wanted to open an account, you needed 40 signatures, which now you don't. There's a gentleman over there, and probably this will be the last question. I know there were a lot of hands, and so apologies for that, but I'm sure Dr. Baqir might have time afterwards for Q&A.
My name is Bakhtiar. I'm a Master of Local Econ Development here at the LSE. Now, my research focuses primarily on governance in Pakistan cities and the lack thereof. And I'm glad you touched on real estate. And you further touched on the certain undocumented sectors, retail, jewelry, auto. Now, in a future reform program, when we think about documenting these undocumented sectors, regulating them, what should that reform program entail, especially in a context where incumbents and future incumbents might be beholden to these very large and powerful interest groups? And on your point about effective communication and why people don't know about these things, I think one look at the State Bank website might be a very good answer. I think the UI could be improved a lot.
Yeah. So on your second point, I fully agree. But I would also say that if you go on the State Bank's website, on the home page itself, what we were talking about right now, the initiative for promoting women's financial inclusion, right on the home page, on the top half, is the initiative banking on equality. There is also the initiative for easy data, which makes access of data very easy. I'm not sure how many people themselves have an open mind to go and try, as opposed to having a notion, perhaps formed for good reasons, that it's a government or a public sector organization, it would not have much more to offer. So there is, some role for both. And it's not that hard to also persevere, even if the UI is not that great. All the information is there, right? So again, what I've shared with you is information on the website. You will click and you will get it. And that's on the home page. Now, with regards to, I think, some of the other things that can be done, look, there are segments in the financial system, traders, professionals, other, many of which are not in the tax net. Right? So it would be very easy to say that here is a list of the sectors that need to be brought into the tax net. But again, I would not start there. Because what you want to do is you want to think about what is the process that will lead to whichever political party is in office after the next elections to actually own that. So you want to think about how will you go early to the leaders of all political parties, and you will say, this is a conversation that we need to have. This is a forum that we need to create. You need to give a blessing to this forum, because guess what? You may be in office after the elections, and it's going to be in your interest if you have a higher tax to GDP ratio than you have right now. And if you get their backing to invest in the process itself, then it'll have the ownership. And invite those people from the various sectors that are going to be taxed to come and put forward their perspective. If your ideas have merit, and if there is transparency in the discussion that you do, make it open discussion, your ideas will prevail. The court of public opinion will be with you. And if that is the process you create, then its implementation and ownership will not be controversial. So again, my message is we need to think about what is the process and what are the principles of good, respectful, fair debate and discussion that we can have so that we can get to that destination with ownership. And that any party, it doesn't matter which party it is, that will then be in office will find it in its own interest to implement this, because it was part of a process that we all agreed to the rules of the game of that process.
Thank you for that, and I'm sorry we have run out of time, and I'll just request Usman, the treasurer of the party, to end the proceedings. But before that, I'll just thank Dr. Baqir for his insights, the ideas, and especially for his thoughts that we should not be pointing fingers at others all the time for our problems, whether it's IMF or, I know in the previous sessions, there's a general tendency to blame one institution or the other institution, whether it's political or non-political. And I think we should be proud of our shared identity. Once you're proud of your shared identity, then you are proud of yourself, your family, your parents, your country. And thank you for giving the examples that there have been cases where Pakistan has done well and change has happened. Perhaps we are not aware of that change. Perhaps we don't know how about these transformation in the tech side and regulation side. I, as an investor in Pakistan, seen some of that. So I'm really glad that you brought some of those examples here.
I'm just glad nobody asked me if Pakistan will default.
That's a big.
And I'm glad we've run out of time.
The conversation could have been slightly more pessimistic then, perhaps. But Usman, yes, waiting for you.
Thank you for your questions, everyone. Pakistan is indeed facing one of its worst economic crises, and it is imperative that we have targeted discourse that retrospects on past mistakes and lays out a structural framework for the future. Moreover, a discussion on the country's future cannot ignore its economic predicaments and the plight of the nation's poor. Therefore, we are thankful to Mr. Reza Baqir for his services and for bestowing us with his presence. We are honored to host him to talk about fiscal challenges, particularly unsustainable debt, and methods to promote growth. His tenure at the State Bank was truly transformational, and having him give us a bit of color on his time was incredibly insightful for all of us. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Ali Farid Khwaja for moderating and engendering an enlightening discussion and highlighting both the shortcomings of Pakistan's policies regarding sustainable debt and growth, and the path forward by giving his view from a capital market lens of the economy. We hope that the audience found this session engaging and fruitful. We will now break for a brief intermission before introducing our final session of this year's Future of Pakistan conference, titled A Conversation with the Honorable Mrs. Justice Aisha A. Malik. Lastly, those returning for our next session, please ensure that you have the appropriate wristband correlating with the session. Thank you, and see you in a bit.
Thank you, Ali.